In this lecture, we're looking at Abelard on the doctrine of the Trinity. And when we come to Abelard, we come to one of the great medieval bad boys in the history of the church. Abelard was a precocious man. He was a savant. From a very young age, he was being elevated and appreciated for his intellect. And above all, he was one of the most important figures to wrestle with the questions of the limits of faith and reason. And Abelard comes from the area of Brittany, up in the northern part of modern-day France. And Abelard, from a very young age, was being put forward for intellectual distinction. He went down at one point and actually studied with Anselm. The two were contemporaries. In the end, Anselm didn't like some of the things that he had to say, and Anselm eventually sort of shuts him down, and Abelard therefore goes back to the city of Paris. And we're told all kinds of things about Abelard, both from his contemporaries and from his own pen. Abelard actually wrote an autobiography towards the end of his life. We are told that hundreds, and at least according to one account, thousands of people would come to hear his lectures. We're also told that he was quite a handsome guy, muy macho, which I can only guess was not very common for those in the monastic academic disciplines in this day and age. And in Paris, Abelard begins to lecture to great fanfare. What happens next, though, in his life is one of the more salacious stories in the Middle Ages, and it gave rise, in some ways, to the context of who Abelard was. As we'll see by the end of this lecture, Abelard was known as a bad boy not only in his personal life, but also according to those in the establishment within the church of his day. And he was condemned on at least several occasions. Well, the story goes of his days in Paris that Abelard grew, you might say, a bit bored with the simple life of intellectual leisure and lectures and these kinds of things. And he noticed a young, precocious woman by the name of Heloise. Heloise was the niece of Fulbert, who was the prior of a local order there in the city of Paris. Well, Abelard pursues her, and the two eventually start up a pretty raucous love affair, and eventually they gave into each other and began a sexual relationship. Now, Abelard at this point is a minor celebrity, and so it's not easy to hide these kinds of things, and eventually they become quite well known. Heloise, by the way, had no intentions of joining the monastery, of becoming a nun. She was simply a precocious young woman, very intellectual and very well learned. Abelard, of course, being an academic, an intellectual, a philosopher, had before him the ideal that he would join a monastery, or at least live a celibate life. But of course, he didn't want to do this, and so he and Heloise begin their love affair. The story begins to take a rocky turn, though, when Heloise becomes pregnant. Abelard does his best to protect her innocence, and he takes her up to Brittany, where she eventually has the child. One of the more interesting sort of side points on this is that they actually named their child Astrolabe, after this scientific invention from around their day. I joke with students that it's a bit like naming your son iPad, or something like this. Astrolabe was so important for their own day, and apparently that's what Heloise and Abelard decided was going to be the name of their son. Well, at this point, Fulbert begins to really weigh heavily on the situation. This is due obviously to the fact that Heloise, being one of his family members, that he wants to look out for her. Fulbert, though, is also quite possessive, though, really not certain why this dashing young intellectual is pursuing his niece so heavily. We'll never know quite Fulbert's intentions behind any of this, why he was so possessive. It doesn't seem to be only the morals of the day being that this was a scandal. Rather, it does seem to be the case that he was affronted that someone from his family was being used in this way. Well, in the end, Abelard does attempt to make good on the fact that he'd had a child with Heloise. He does offer to marry Heloise, but he makes the rather strange demand that their marriage be kept secret. This is not due to shame per se, but rather, again, because Abelard is a philosopher, he does not want to be exposed as a married man. In many ways, the prospects of a lecturer and of an intellectual would dry up if it was known that he was married, particularly married with children. Heloise doesn't want to do this, though. She, in many ways, has a pure love for Abelard. She realizes that a secret marriage makes good on the fact that they'd had a son together, but rather that it would also put in perennial jeopardy Abelard's career. She offers, in a sort of strange, twisted, self-sacrificing way, to simply be his mistress. But Abelard insists, and so they are secretly married. To hide the fact that they are married, Heloise is eventually sent off to a nearby nunnery, where she is to live. Now, she doesn't join as a nun, at least not at this point. She is simply a civilian, someone from the outside world who has come there to live. Fulbert at this point seems somewhat placated, though he is increasingly suspicious of the fact that Abelard doesn't seem to really have the best intentions for Heloise. The two continue on again with a real hot and heavy love affair. At one point, they have sex in a corner of the dining hall of the nunnery, which of course is very scandalous. As time wore on, though, Abelard decides that he wants to hide the marriage even more, and so he begins to insist that Heloise wear the habit of apostolate. That is to say, wear the habit of somebody not yet fully a nun, but someone who is considering being a nun. Just think Sound of Music. Maria is apostolate there at the beginning of the movie. She's not yet a nun, and the nuns are trying to solve a problem like Maria, because they're not sure if they're going to take her, and eventually they don't, and they send her off to the Von Trapp family. That's really what Abelard has in mind. Hide the fact that she's his wife by putting her in a nunnery and actually having her wear the habit of apostolate. Well, it's that move, the forcing of Heloise to wear the habit, that eventually drove Fulbert crazy. He senses in this some ulterior motive where Abelard is going to throw off Heloise and force her to become a nun, thus absolving on some level their union. And so Fulbert hires a band of thugs, and they break into Abelard's rooms one evening, and they castrate him. Really sort of the ultimate response of the honor of the family that Fulbert believes he needs to pay vengeance back on Abelard and his member for the way that they have both treated his niece. Well, needless to say, Abelard doesn't have the desires of marriage anymore. And in general, it's from this pivot, from this turning point in his life, the mutilation of his body by the henchmen of Fulbert, that sends him off fully to be an intellectual. Now, Heloise and Abelard do keep up a correspondence. In fact, even to this day, in popular printing, we have the letters of Heloise and Abelard. And too often people believe that these are actual love letters, that these are people who have been sort of star-crossed lovers kept apart, this kind of a thing. Actually, just go ahead and read them. What's going on here is Heloise is expressing her genuine love for Abelard. She expresses her pain over the fact that they could no longer be together. And in the end, Heloise herself takes on the actual habit. She becomes a nun. And so precocious is she that eventually she becomes the head of her order, the head of her community. And she runs it with a real effective hand. But, always looking back, she sends letters to Abelard, proclaiming her love, lamenting the love that had been lost. Abelard, though, really doesn't want to hear this. Perhaps angry at the situation, perhaps blaming Heloise for the actions of Fulbert on some level, he eventually writes her and says, "Leave this behind. Stop looking back." He does admit that it was a punishment by God, that they had been doing wrong, but he says, "Leave me behind, forget me." And Heloise in the end says, "Okay, I will no longer send you letters telling you of my love and of how much I miss you." And so Abelard is really the bad boy until the end. One of the strange sort of modern twists to this, by the way, if you go to the cemetery there in the heart of Paris, and this is a pretty famous cemetery, Jim Morrison, The Doors, is buried there because he died of a drug and alcohol overdose while there in the city. And there are other famous Parisians there as well. Well, there's a famous tomb that is alleged to be the final resting place of Heloise and Abelard. And it's a bit quaint, the two lovers brought back together once again, belying any historical reality of the fact the two end up actually not being lovers who are torn apart, but rather Abelard has rejected Heloise and gone his own way. And by the way, there is some dispute as to whether or not this is actually their remains. But back to Abelard. Abelard's main focus for the entirety of his career was really to continue the project that Anselm began on parsing out and concluding the limits of faith and reason. Now, Abelard has a unique perspective on this. Anselm, of course, had put the two in a relatively tense relationship. Anselm never quite determines when one begins and one ends, but he nevertheless believed that faith and reason are held in dialectic. Abelard takes the case even further. Abelard, in fact, is one of the first real serious devotees of Aristotle. And Aristotle, at least in the context of his own day, had a number of criticisms of the way that Plato did his philosophy. In particular, the way that Plato believed that he had accounted for the way that humans know things, through this idea of the forms and this abstract reality. Aristotle said, nope, we need a more concrete, rational category for things. And in a manner of speaking, where Abelard ends up with this is he lands on the conclusion that really there is not a fundamental distinction between faith and reason. He appeals to another idea, that of illumination. Illumination, Abelard says, is something external, in this case from God, coming into our minds and giving us the wisdom or the illumination to see with new eyes. Abelard, in a manner of speaking, says it's the same process in faith as we have in reason. Philosophy, the rational mind, is seeking illumination. It strives for a perfect harmony of the categories of thought with the sensory experience that we have as it comes to us. And Abelard says faith is much the same way. There's no reason, he says, to see these as in tension, as if one picks up where the other leaves off. And so he, in a manner of speaking, overlaps the two and proclaims that when it comes to the items of the faith, the doctrines of the faith, we can apply pretty rigorous, one might say cold logic to these doctrines in order to come up with their conclusions. Now, the modern person, and even people in Abelard's own day, accused him of really being only about reason, really being only about philosophy, and you'll see why here in a minute. But Abelard really is attempting, he believes, to overlap categories in a way that makes them harmonious and makes both really on the same foundation. Again, though, the problem, repeatedly, the issue that gets Abelard into all kinds of trouble is his willingness, a willingness that Anselm did not share, by the way, to attack doctrines that had been more or less fixed from the beginning, and to attempt, he believed, to come up with new rational articulations and groundings for doctrines that are cherished and beloved by all Christians. And so we're going to look at one of them here, and then we're going to look at one in our next lecture. For the rest of this lecture, we're going to look at what Abelard has to say about the doctrine of the Trinity. And in our next lecture, we're going to look at Abelard on the Atonement, one of the more controversial subjects that Abelard ever wrote on. But the Trinity is actually, in his own day, one of the subjects that Abelard was most attacked for. Abelard wrote a total of 3 separate tracts on the Trinity, coming back again and again and again to this doctrine in an effort to understand it. The problem, though, is they continued to be condemned. The first work that Abelard put out on the Trinity was actually condemned in 1121 at the Council of Soissons, and he was accused at this council of holding to Sabellianism, which you'll recall is the ancient heresy of what we often call today Modalism. Sabellianism or Modalism is the idea that there really is only one God and he wears different hats or different masks when he appears as the Father or the Son and the Spirit. Now, in some ways, this charge against Abelard is unfair, as we'll see. He believes he's made an account for the difference between the 3 persons of the Trinity. But it is actually somewhat ironic because Sabellianism, in a manner of speaking, was the ancient rational heresy. It was the idea that, well, if the Trinity doesn't make any sense, it might make more sense just to come up with a conceptualization of one God and 3 hats, or 3 masks. And Abelard does come close to this doctrine, and so his first work was condemned. His third work was also condemned in 1141, this time at the Council of Sens, due in large part to the intervention of Bernard of Clairvaux. Now, keep Bernard in your mind. We're going to have a lecture on him in 2 lectures from now. But Bernard is one of the great antagonists to Abelard. He just simply doesn't like the guy. Some of the confusion we have, even down to the modern world, about what Abelard taught, in fact, comes in large part to the real scandalous ways that Bernard described his theology and the ways that he had him condemned. Well, in the end, Abelard is actually at one point excommunicated. Again, through the intervention of Bernard, the Pope excommunicates Abelard. Abelard does manage to send a letter through some of his friends, and the judgment of excommunication is suspended, but Abelard is forever silenced, and he is told to go back to Paris and shut up. Well, what was Abelard's teachings on the Trinity that got him in such hot water? Well, in large part, what gets Abelard in trouble is the way he approaches the Trinitarian doctrine itself. Abelard begins with the idea that if the Trinity is going to be an official doctrine, it can't be based fundamentally on mystery. This again goes back to the classic obscurantist on the one side and the rationalist on the other. If that spectrum holds true, Abelard really is pushing towards more of the rationalist side. And he accuses the traditional articulation of the Trinity as being more on the obscurantist side. People just throw up their hands and say, well, he's 3 in 1, la-di-da, let's keep going. At least this is how Abelard sees the doctrine as being articulated. And so Abelard begins with this fundamental conviction that even the Trinity, though it is beyond our capacity to comprehend fully, nevertheless must make logical, clear sense if it's going to be a doctrine we're going to hold. And he begins with this strange concept that there are adumbrations or foreshadowings of the doctrine of the Trinity in pagan philosophy. Now, he thinks he's doing a pious thing here. He believes that if the Trinitarian model is true, well, then it must be discovered and discoverable by anyone who is a man of wisdom. And again, Abelard has high regard for the Platonic and Aristotelian philosophers of the ancient world. Well, Abelard ends up with this rather strange conclusion that the forerunners to Christianity, those in Greek philosophy, were actually, because of their wisdom, able to come up with an idea of the concept of God, and he says they also taught the Trinity. Now, anyone who's read this part of Abelard finds him to be quite bonkers. He has to be a complete eisegete, you might say. He has to do some gymnastics to get Plato and Aristotle and these folks to appear to be teaching certain concepts of the Trinity. Now, Abelard does not believe, of course, that they're holding out the creedal formula of homoousios. So rather, he looks for these strange, as I said, adumbrations, these little foreshadowings, the differences in the way they describe certain spiritual forces or theological concepts or philosophical concepts. And he says, well, here's the Trinity, there's the Trinity, and there's the Trinity over there. It made perfect sense to him. He doesn't stop there, though. Abelard is also one of the few folks, frankly, in the church's history. There have really never been more than a handful, really, over time, until the modern world. Abelard is one of the people who argues that these pagan philosophers, because of their illumination, because fundamentally faith and reason function on the same principle, because they are illumined, because they are wise, he argues, well, they are saved. They knew God before Christ had come. And so he argues, congratulations, you're going to see Socrates and Plato and Aristotle in heaven. Now, again, a lot of this is made fun of. Abelard is sort of teased by people of a variety of different stripes over the centuries. How in the world could he do this? At the very least, people who are historians of the Greco-Roman world just shake their head at this. So very often, Abelard proves his points by bending and twisting the original meaning of Plato or Aristotle or someone else. But what's going on? Why is Abelard trying this? Well, again, his fundamental conception of faith and reason is that they come from illumination. And so therefore, he says, if illumination is there, it must be there by God. Therefore, God has called them, drawn them, and somehow saved them by his own action, with or without the gospel message, or even, since this is pre-Christ, joining the Jewish Israelite community and becoming one of the people of God. In a manner of speaking, what Abelard is trying to do is to defend the turf of the philosophers as being one of their own, as being Christian in orientation. Now again, no one buys this in his own day. Even the most zealous defenders of the wisdom of Aristotle or Plato, people like Aquinas and others, they would never go to the point of arguing that this illumination, this wisdom that they had, was tantamount to salvation. But Abelard goes there. But using that basis, this idea that there are adumbrations or echoings of the Trinity throughout all philosophy and all of the Christian world, he lands on this idea that therefore he can use the same tools of critical, rational philosophy to attack and to clarify, he thinks, the doctrine of the Trinity. And one of the more important things that Abelard gives to the conversation, you might say, of Western philosophy, particularly in the Middle Ages, but even long after, is the idea of his description of how we use analogous language when we're describing God. Abelard is actually quite trenchant on this. He points out that we have to use very clear categories when we're talking about God. We have to be careful, because there are times, he says, when we're using pure metaphor. When we describe God as a rock, well, no one believes he's a rock in the sky. But when we describe God as good or as Father, are we using an analogy there? Are we using something from our frame of reference to describe God when it may or may not be a reference that he himself is in his own being? This sometimes comes up specifically on that issue of the fatherhood of God. In what way is he a father? Is that an analogy that we use based on our concept of what a father is? Or is it something that is essential to God's being, that he is a father, in particular in relationship to the Son? Well, based on that, Abelard moves into the description of the Trinity. And he argues that when it comes to the Trinity, when it comes to describing God, we can't use concrete language because that would be illogical. We can't use language that we believe, he says, is equal signs with who God is in and of himself in his being. Rather, he argues, we have to use, here's a jargon word, similitudes. Now, similitude throughout the history of philosophy, particularly in the modern world, is really just our modern 21st century word for analogy, or maybe a bit less on the nose, metaphor. A similitude is something that is analogous. Again, the idea of God as Father, that he is a rock, etc. And he says we must be careful when we use language about God as if that somehow implies something about his being. Abelard then pulls the lens quite a bit back, and he says, what we need to describe instead, if we're going to understand the Trinity properly, is not so much the language of him being Father and Son and Spirit, though he obviously still embraces those words, but rather he says we need to focus and drill far down into the language of sameness and difference. And he says, in what way is God the same in these three persons? In what way is Father, Son, and Spirit the same thing that makes them God? And in what ways are they different? Well, the primary analogy that Abelard comes up with is really one of the reasons why he gets in hot water. Abelard begins to use the analogy of a wax tablet, a wax thing. He says if you were to walk into a room and see three wax medallions, you might say, sitting on the table, and someone were to say how much wax is in the room, you wouldn't reply back that there are three different entirely separate beings of wax. Rather, you'd say you have wax there on the table. How much wax do I have? Well, I have 3 medallions worth. They are the same in the sense that they have the same essence or the same properties. The next step, though, is where Abelard goes a bit off the rails. He argues that, however, if you were to take a signet, a ring, let's say, and you were to impress in that wax a seal, maybe a king's seal, something that was used very much in his own day, these sort of wax impressions that allowed the person to know where this letter, let's say, had come from if it was sealed in wax. Well, Abelard says, if you were to impress something upon this wax, it would be different. You would have 3 items that are the exact same, but because of the impression that is upon it, you would have 3 things that you could, in some, at least analogous language, argue are 3 different things. There's a wax that is impressed to be this thing, the wax that is impressed to be this thing, and the wax over here that is impressed to be something else. And he goes on from there and he argues a lot of very subtle, complex arguments about the relationship between sameness and difference. The problem, though, is, again, when he describes this analogy of wax, he is coming very, very close, as he was charged and as he was condemned for teaching, with the ideas of modalism. 3 substances of wax with 3 impressions sounds dangerously close to the idea that you have God in 3 different masks. Now, you could probably read Abelard more charitably here. He's using an analogy to describe what he means by a more complex, abstract idea of the relationship between sameness and difference. He was trying to parse out the difference by saying that the Father, Son, and the Spirit have the same substance, but he avoids the language of personhood and instead talks about this essential difference between the three of them. And he says the Son is the Son because he is the one who comes. The essential difference of him, being essentially the same substance as God the Father and God the Spirit, is that he has this essential difference of coming down to be the Savior. The Father doesn't come down to save on the cross, and neither does the Spirit. So again, you could probably read Abelard more charitably here. But needless to say, this signals one of the great problems of using too much analogy when we're describing the Trinity. In the end, Abelard's quite complex and multifaceted arguments here really put him on the outs when it came to the establishment there within medieval Europe. Bernard of Clairvaux went after him, as well as several councils and even a pope at one point excommunicated him. We can see here, though, that the fundamental root of what Abelard is attempting is something that's quite unique. He's trying to run every doctrine, even the core ones that, by and large, people would consider to be established and ironclad by this point in the Middle Ages. He's trying to run all of these doctrines through the rigors of the rational mind. And, in his mind, if something doesn't pass intellectual muster, it needs to be kept off. And it's for that reason that he decides not to describe God as one essence, which he does keep, but three persons, which is the creedal historic view, and instead he tries to land pretty squarely on some new idea about something called essential difference. Now again, there's a charitable way to read Abelard on this, and it's not enough to simply to give him pot shots for having gotten in trouble for his descriptions here, but rather it signals something of where Abelard is coming from. More problematic, of course, is his use and his defense of the salvation of those who were very clearly neither Jewish nor Christian, the Greek philosophers. And it's that interest on the salvation of souls and on this idea of illumination that actually pushes Abelard further and further to conclude a new set of doctrines, or a new set of principles, you might say, as to how Christ saves us, how he came down, and what the atonement of Christ achieved in us, not just simply for us. And we'll look at that issue in our next lecture.